I'm going to do a simple comparison video between the Leica M11 and the Leica Q2. It's not a technical comparison in any way, but I'm just going to show how I set up my cameras and the different ways that I use them. I've had the Q2 for over a year, but I've only had the M11 for a couple months. But there is a difference between the ways that I use them, one being a rangefinder and all manual, and the other one having autofocus. The big benefit of the Leica M11 is that you can change out the lenses, but today I'm going to be sticking with the 50mm Summilux and compare that with the 28mm Summilux on the Leica Q2. They're both great lenses, and the two focal lengths are far enough apart that you can tell the difference, and it gives a good wide range of versatility between the 28 and the 50. So I'll show some sample shots in this video. Starting with the M11, the build quality is top of the line. The size of the camera body is about the same as the Q2, but to me it feels a little bit smaller and more compact and more dense and heavier. It's hard to describe, but it just has a slightly better feel and handle to it, and that just makes it more fun to use and to shoot with. The way I use it is basically an aperture priority mode. I control the aperture to control the depth of field, and I let the camera choose the ISO and the shutter speed to get the correct exposure. I usually try to stay with f1.4 when I'm shooting close-up shots or most subjects, and then I use f8 if I'm shooting distant scenery or buildings. So basically either choosing f1.4 or f8. There's a few customizable buttons, and the way I use it is I use the FN button to choose between a single shot or a 2-second self timer, and then the right wheel I use for exposure compensation. If I push down on the wheel, I can choose between the ISO settings, and then there's a small button up front which I use to turn on the live view or turn off the live view. Mostly I just keep the live view on. You can turn it off to save some battery life. And for accessories, I'm using the regular Leica neck strap, and I'm using this case from Amazon, which was very inexpensive, but the leather is high quality and has the same texture as the camera, but it has a nice contrast between the brown and the black. I took each camera out on a separate day, and the first day was in the countryside and a small forest with the 50mm Summilux. It's slightly tricky to get the right focus at f1.4, but I'm slowly getting better with the rangefinder. I like the shallow depth of field and how everything just blurs away in the background. Using this 50mm on an SL2 would make it even easier to get the right focus. You can use capture assistance and focus peaking on the M11 by using the live view screen, but I did all of these shots strictly using the rangefinder patch. The colors are great on this lens and on this camera. I didn't have to tweak the colors much at all, but I did have to bring up the contrast on almost all of these pictures. As far as exposure, I usually keep the exposure compensation down to a -1, unless it's in dark lighting conditions. Today was a cloudy day, and I purposely underexposed some of these shots because I like that dark, moody appearance in the forest. I also used a Pro Mist diffusion filter at 1/8 strength, but it's actually hard for me to tell the difference. So I think I'll need to get a 1/4 strength diffusion filter to really notice the difference. I want to try to get some of that vintage look to my photos without actually having to buy a vintage lens. And going on to the Leica Q2, another compact camera that's fun to use. And I have this with the Leica leather half case and a neck strap from Peak Design. It has an amazing quality 28 millimeter Summilux lens that opens up to f1.7. You are restricted to that just one lens, but the camera adds other functionality such as macro mode, video capability, weatherproofing, and of course autofocus. When I first got the camera, I used it mainly in totally automatic mode. But since shooting with the M camera, I'm starting to appreciate using this in manual mode also. But most of the time I use it in aperture priority, and I let the camera choose the ISO and shutter speed. Other times I take it off autofocus and I use it on manual focus. For setup, I use the FN button for the self timer, just like the M11. There's also a digital crop button on front, which I sometimes use to crop down to 35. You can do that in the M11, but that's internally through the menus. The right wheel, I also use that for exposure compensation, just like on the M11. And the button is to choose ISO, and that's consistent with the M11 also. Normally I don't use the grid lines or the horizon line on either camera, but I do like the info bars and the histogram on the display screen. This day I shot at a farm amusement park, and I had on my UV filter, which I usually keep on as a default, but it was a bright sunny day, so I thought I should have brought my ND filter, but I think the photos came out fine even without that. It has a capability to do high shutter speeds, and some of these shots use the electronic shutter to get the right exposure. And again, most of these were shot wide open at 1.7, except for some of the distance shots, which were shot at f8. And again, the colors looked great also, similar to the M11. And similarly, I had to bring up the contrast with these images also. So there's my comparison between the Q2 and the M11. I brought the Q2 out to the park because I like that autofocus, and I'm able to get quick shots of the kids and moving objects. And the M11 I took to the forest for still shots where I could take my time with getting the accurate focus. So the Q2 worked great at the park. The 28 millimeter was a nice field of view, and I was also able to digitally crop down to 35 in some of these photos. And the M11, I like that for the portrait shots and close-up shots, and that nice shallow depth of field. Let me know in the comments how you use your Leica and whether you like the M system or the Q system better.